The kitchen was alive with a gentle chaos, the smell of roasted chicken, a hint of vanilla from the pie, and the soft murmur of the radio. I glanced at the clock. John was due to arrive any moment. He insisted on celebrating his birthday with us, even though his wife was in the hospital. There was something bittersweet about it, but he handled it with his usual ease. "Are you sure everything's ready?" Ryan's tone betrayed his irritation despite his composed demeanor. He was eager to leave early. Work again. "Of course," I nodded, adjusting the tray of glasses. "Just pretend you're interested for a couple of hours." John arrived right on time, as always. He was his usual self, energetic, with a light smile masking his exhaustion. In his hands, he held a bottle of wine and a bouquet, slightly out of place, but undeniably charming. Dinner began with toasts. Raising his glass, John quipped, "Caitlin, you've always had a knack for turning any evening into a celebration, even the unplanned ones." I noticed Ryan smirk and look away. His indifference to anything about me had become routine, but the moment still stung. John, on the other hand, met my eyes directly, with a look I hadn't seen from my husband in a long time. The evening ended sooner than expected. Ryan excused himself for urgent matters, leaving us alone. I tried to maintain composure, but every moment in John's company was a reminder of what I was missing. When John offered to pour another glass of wine, I didn't refuse. The morning began with the soft patter of rain on the windows and the gentle glow of sunlight breaking through gray clouds. I walked into the kitchen to find John already busy making breakfast. His confident movements as he chopped vegetables and whisked eggs brought a lively warmth to the space. "Hope you don't mind me invading your kingdom a little," he said with a smile as he noticed me. "Only if the breakfast lives up to expectations," I replied, trying to sound lighthearted, though his presence made me unusually aware of myself. As he worked, I noticed how he wiped crumbs off the cutting board, rinsed the knives in the sink, and even cleaned the stove. Ryan never paid attention to such details. To him, the kitchen was merely a place to get food, not a space that required care. "Have you always been this neat?" I asked, watching as he carefully arranged sliced bread on a plate. "Maybe. It helps me feel more in control," he replied without looking up. "By the way, do you remember when I used to help you with algebra back in high school?" I smiled, recalling those evenings with textbooks when I struggled to make sense of formulas, and he patiently explained. "Of course," I said. "You saved me from failing everything except literature." "Well, you were already the best at that," he teased. There was a warm nostalgia in his words, taking me back to a time when life felt simpler. We talked about the past as breakfast came together, and I couldn't help but notice how his attention to detail made the moment special. Ryan rarely stayed in the kitchen. His presence there was more of an exception than a habit. With John, everything felt different, effortless, natural. When I set the plates on the table, he placed a hand on my shoulder, thanking me for the help. The brief touch was unexpected, but strangely comforting. "Breakfast turned out great," I said, trying to mask my flustered feelings. His eyes lingered on mine a second longer than necessary, but he only smiled. Ryan left again, not even finishing dinner. He claimed urgent matters that couldn't wait. It wasn't the first time in recent weeks, but tonight it truly unsettled me. John stayed. We cleared the table, and he offered to help with the dishes. I nodded, trying not to dwell on how his presence filled the void Ryan seemed to leave behind. When the house quieted, I went upstairs, but sleep didn't come. My thoughts were tangled. I struggled to understand what I was feeling. Ryan was my husband, the man I had built a life with. But what was this cold emptiness growing between us? The clock showed well past midnight when I decided to go outside for some air. The night was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp grass. Moonlight illuminated the path to the garden bench. To my surprise, John was already there. He sat with his arms crossed, gazing at the night sky. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly, noticing me. "Seems I'm not the only one." I tried to smile. I sat beside him, feeling a strange tension lingering between us. "You know, I've always loved moments like this," John said, gesturing toward the stars. "They remind me of how small we are, but also how important." I stayed silent, unsure how to respond. His words felt too personal, as though they touched something deeper than just the stars. "Are you happy, Caitlin?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. I wanted to lie, to say yes, everything was fine. But instead, I only shrugged. "Sometimes I think happiness is just an illusion," I muttered. John turned to me. His gaze held understanding, but also something more. Something that made me look away. "You've always deserved more than just illusions," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. I stood up. It was too much, too close to something I couldn't allow myself to acknowledge. "It's late. I should get some sleep," I said abruptly and walked away, feeling my heart race too fast. The next evening, with Ryan once again working late, I decided to step outside into the garden for some quiet time. The night air was cool, and the faint scent of flowers filled the space with a sense of calm. I sat on the same bench where John and I had talked the night before. He appeared a few minutes later, as if he knew exactly where to find me. In his hand, he held a small box wrapped in a simple ribbon. "This is for you," he said, slightly embarrassed, handing me the gift. "What is it?" I asked, surprised, taking the box. "I just wanted to remind you of the past." I untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside was a small star-shaped keychain. I remembered how in high school John used to give me little trinkets like this for holidays or just to cheer me up. "You still remember?" I asked, tracing the cool metal with my fingers. "Some things aren't easy to forget, Caitlin." We sat in silence for a few moments, both lost in thought. Then John broke it. "Do you remember how we used to dream about the future? Everything seemed so simple back then. And now it's all different," I said quietly, avoiding his gaze. He reached out as if to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, but instead his hand brushed against mine. The light, almost insignificant touch made me hold my breath. "Sorry," he said, but his eyes didn't leave mine. My hand lingered in his, and that small gesture became the point of no return. Suddenly, the world around us faded. It was just him and his closeness. His lips met mine, hesitant at first, as though asking for permission. The kiss lasted only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. When he pulled back, his voice was rough. "Caitlin, I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." I didn't reply. I simply stood, clutching the box with the keychain to my chest, and walked back into the house, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Ryan suggested spending the evening together, as if trying to rekindle some warmth in our relationship. His suggestion caught me off guard, but I agreed, hoping it might bring us closer. I prepared his favorite dishes, creating a cozy atmosphere. For the first time in a long while, we sat down without distractions. No gadgets, no outside interruptions. Yet the silence during dinner felt deafening. We exchanged small talk about the house, work, and weekend plans. Every word felt forced, as though a stranger's voice was trying to fill the void between us. Ryan looked tired, as always. He barely glanced at me, his attention drifting elsewhere. Even when he tried to offer a compliment, it sounded too mundane to be meaningful. After dinner, he fell asleep on the couch, not even finishing the news. I cleared the table and sat by the window, watching the city slowly sink into the night. A growing sense of emptiness filled me, as if everything that once connected us had slipped away, leaving only fragments of memories. I couldn't help but think about that recent evening with John, his attentive gaze, the small gesture that seemed to say more than words. The contrast gnawed at me. I tried to convince myself these were just temporary difficulties, but my heart insisted otherwise. The next day I met Sarah. Our meetings were always quiet, almost ritualistic. She listened as I described the evening with Ryan, his detachment, and how hard it had become to find common ground. Sarah listened carefully, her expression slightly tense, and then offered words of caution. Her tone sounded like a warning I already knew but didn't want to accept. I nodded, but my thoughts still drifted back to John, to how he looked at me, to how he listened. The house needed a refresh. The furniture had been in the same place for ages, and I decided that rearranging things might bring some new energy to the space. John offered to help when he noticed my unsuccessful attempts to move the heavy cabinet in the living room. "Let me handle it," he said with a slight smile, his tone confident enough for me to step aside. We started with the bookcase. His strong arms easily lifted the furniture while I held the books, stacking them in piles on the floor. Every now and then, our hands brushed accidentally, and each time I felt a strange chill run through me. "Do you rearrange often?" he asked, leaning against the cabinet. "Not really, but sometimes it feels like a change is needed," I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. The work was physically demanding, but there was something more between us than just the shared task. John seemed to feel it too, falling silent at times, as if afraid of saying too much. When we finished, I sat on the edge of the couch, wiping sweat from my forehead. John remained standing, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than it should have. "Thanks for the help," I said, avoiding his eyes. "Always happy to help," he replied, his voice calm but with a hint of warmth. Ryan came home earlier than usual. He glanced around at the newly arranged furniture, but something in his expression betrayed suspicion. He seemed more attentive to details he'd previously ignored. How I adjusted my hair, how I quickly hid something on the kitchen counter, how I muted my mood to avoid drawing attention. I could feel his gaze lingering longer than usual, but he didn't say anything. His silence was more unsettling than any potential questions. Meanwhile, my pull toward John grew stronger. I tried to convince myself it was just friendship, simple admiration, but every word he spoke, every glance he gave, left me questioning more. It felt like everything was becoming more complicated. Between me, John, and Ryan, there was a subtle line I feared crossing, yet every day I inched closer to it. I hadn't allowed myself to relax in a long time. Morning workouts had become a habit, the only time I could focus solely on myself. But today, everything went wrong. I lifted the dumbbells too abruptly, and a sharp pain shot through my shoulder. The weight slipped from my hands as I let out a quiet gasp. I tried to raise my arm, but the pain only intensified. Struggling to reach the bathroom, I realized that even simple movements were becoming unbearable. A hot shower might help ease the tension in my muscles, but I couldn't manage it alone. I glanced around in frustration. The house was silent. Ryan had left early. The only person who could help was John. I hesitated, but finally called out to him. A minute later, he was standing at the bathroom door, looking slightly uneasy but ready to assist. "Are you sure?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I just can't reach on my own," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. I turned away, catching a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. The sheer fabric of my robe barely concealed my body, but I had no choice. John turned on the water, checking the temperature, then gently touched my shoulder to help remove the robe. His touch was hesitant, but the gesture was surprisingly tender. The water cascaded over my skin, wrapping it in warmth, but my thoughts were solely on his hands. John was silent, yet his touch spoke volumes. He carefully washed my back, avoiding the injured area. At one point, his fingers lingered just a little too long. I turned my head to meet his gaze, and in his eyes I saw something more than mere concern. "Caitlin," he whispered, but didn't finish. Time seemed to freeze. His hands stilled, but the tension between us became almost tangible. I couldn't find the words to stop this, but I didn't want to. He was closer than he should have been. I hadn't noticed how it happened, but his face was just inches from mine. Another moment, and his lips met mine. This wasn't an accidental kiss. It was filled with everything we had been trying to suppress but could no longer hide. We knew we had gone too far. I pulled away sharply, feeling shame and desire battling within me. "We shouldn't have," I began, but the words felt hollow. John said nothing. His gaze was intense, filled with an understanding I was afraid to confront, the realization that there was no turning back. After my morning injury, the tension in my body only grew. My arm remained stiff, and every movement sent a wave of pain through me. I decided to try another shower, hoping the hot water might relieve some of the discomfort. I left the bedroom and found John in the living room. He was sitting with a book, but the moment he noticed me, he set it aside. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, looking at me closely. I hesitated before replying, "John, I need help. I can't reach my back." He looked uneasy but nodded, clearly understanding that refusing in such a situation would be wrong. As I stepped under the shower, the hot water began to wash away the fatigue, but I couldn't ignore his presence. John stood behind me, trying to be as careful as possible. "Let me know if it hurts," he said softly, his voice almost apologetic. His fingers gently touched my skin, and I felt an unexpected shiver run through me. I tried to remain composed, but my gaze kept drifting toward him through the foggy reflection in the mirror. My emotions betrayed me. Something within me longed for closeness, for the understanding I hadn't found in Ryan for so long. John was tense too. I noticed how he avoided looking at me, but every movement of his hands betrayed his restraint. At one point, his fingers accidentally brushed against my shoulder, and I let out a small gasp. The sound seemed to fill the space between us. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut. "Ryan, go quickly," I whispered, turning to John. Panic surged through me. John, visibly nervous, quickly dried his hands with a towel and left the bathroom, trying not to make a sound. I pretended I had simply been taking a shower, but my heart was pounding too loudly for me to feel at ease. During dinner, the tension became nearly unbearable. Ryan cast strange glances at both me and John, as if noticing something unusual in our movements. "How was your day?" he asked, scrutinizing me as though trying to see more than I wanted to reveal. I gave a brief reply, trying to redirect his attention to the meal I had prepared, but his gaze didn't let me go. John tried to act natural, but his usual ease had vanished, replaced by visible discomfort. All evening I felt an invisible barrier growing between us, a fragile line that became harder to maintain with every passing moment. That evening I couldn't find peace. Everything happening between John and me consumed me to the point where thoughts of Ryan faded into the background. The shower, the touches, his gaze, all of it etched itself into my memory. Impossible to forget. I entered the living room, where John sat with his tablet and stood by the door, hesitating. His presence seemed to draw me in, urging me to cross all the internal lines I'd set for myself. "John," I called softly, and he looked up. For a moment I froze, searching for the strength to say something meaningful. But instead of words, I stepped closer and stopped right in front of him. My hand, almost acting on its own, touched his shoulder. "Caitlin, what are you doing?" His voice was uncertain, but he didn't pull away. My eyes lingered on his, and in that moment, all boundaries crumbled. I leaned in, and our lips met. This wasn't an innocent gesture. This kiss carried everything we had tried to suppress. John froze at first, but then gave in, wrapping his arms around my waist. His hands moved across my back, and I felt the tension of the past weeks dissolve in this moment. Suddenly, the sound of the front door slamming shut broke through. I jumped back as if burned, my heart pounding wildly. "Ryan's back," I whispered. John stood silently, adjusting his shirt, and quickly left the room. I stood there alone, unsure of how to hide what had just happened. Ryan walked into the living room, his eyes scanning the space. His gaze lingered on the couch where John had been sitting, on my disheveled hair, and on the cup perched at the edge of the table. "What were you doing?" he asked, his tone too casual to be genuine. "Just relaxing," I replied, avoiding his eyes. Ryan didn't say anything, but his expression betrayed suspicion. He clearly sensed something, though he didn't press with questions. When he went upstairs, I stayed behind, trying to collect myself. Everything that had happened couldn't be undone. I knew this moment was pivotal, a point after which there would be no turning back. Morning came too quickly. I woke with a heaviness in my chest, feeling that everything in my life had spiraled out of control. The living room was quiet. John had left before dawn, leaving behind a void that only deepened my guilt. On the kitchen table, I found a small box wrapped in a ribbon. Beside it lay a note, and though I knew I shouldn't read it, I couldn't resist. "Caitlin, I'll never forget that moment in the shower. Take care of yourself, John." The words burned me. I quickly stashed the note and gift in a drawer, hoping Ryan wouldn't notice. But as it always happens, the truth didn't stay hidden for long. By evening, Ryan found the box while rummaging through drawers looking for his tablet. I froze when he walked into the living room, holding it in his hands. "What's this?" His voice was low but calm, which made it even more frightening. I didn't know what to say. Lies hovered on the edge of my tongue, but the words wouldn't come. "It's a gift. From John," I finally admitted, realizing there was no point in denying it. "And what's in it?" Ryan threw the box onto the table. I remained silent, but he had already untied the ribbon and pulled out the note. His face went pale before twisting with anger. "Are you going to explain what this means?" I tried to speak calmly, explaining that there was nothing serious between John and me, that it was just emotions brought on by stress. But with every word I said, the tension grew. "Emotions? In the shower?" Ryan nearly shouted, but still held himself back. "Did you think I'd never notice something was going on?" I lowered my head, realizing that my excuses weren't working. "It was a mistake," I whispered, but Ryan was no longer listening. He stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I realized that John's words now haunted me. That note had become not only proof of my feelings, but also the key to the destruction of my family. The house remained engulfed in oppressive silence. Ryan avoided me, his presence heavy like a weight I couldn't shake off. I didn't know how to restore the lost balance and realized I couldn't handle this alone any longer. Sarah welcomed me into her cozy living room, the warmth of candles and the scent of coffee surrounding us. But even this familiar comfort couldn't ease the turmoil inside me. I poured out everything that had been building up, trying to make sense of my actions. She listened intently, her expression cautious as though carefully choosing her words. Inside, I knew she was right, even if her advice felt like a sentence. I feared destroying my family, yet I was increasingly aware that silence was making everything worse. When I returned home, the house was empty. Ryan was at work, and this brief reprieve felt like salvation. But soon a knock at the door broke the fragile stillness. John. His appearance caught me off guard. He stood with a tense expression, as if wrestling with his own emotions. He was here to retrieve his belongings, a clear end to what couldn't continue. As he packed his things in the living room, the tension between us grew. The silence was sharp, filling every corner of the room. I wanted to say something, to explain, but every word felt unnecessary. He only nodded, avoiding my eyes as though afraid to see what still connected us. At that moment, the front door opened. Ryan. He froze, his gaze darting between me, John, and the packed belongings. I saw his eyes narrow, his face hardening with restrained anger. He said nothing, but the tension in the room became unbearable. John quickly grabbed his bag and left without a word. His footsteps faded behind the closed door, leaving Ryan and me alone. He stood still, his eyes piercing, saying more than any words could. I knew there was no turning back. The questions he didn't ask hung heavy in the air. The truth I had feared admitting was now obvious, even without explanation. When the door closed behind John, silence engulfed the room, thick with tension. Ryan stood motionless, his gaze heavy with anger and disappointment piercing through me. Every slight movement he made spoke louder than any words could. I lowered my eyes, avoiding his stare, though it didn't diminish the weight of my guilt. The pause between us grew longer, amplifying my unease. I could feel him piecing everything together in his mind, and the anticipation was worse than any outburst. Ryan moved toward the table where the gift box still lay, and picked it up without a word. His hands tightened around it as he opened it again and reread the note. His movements were sharp, restrained, as though he feared unleashing the fury simmering beneath the surface. He tossed the box back onto the table and turned away. I could see the turmoil within him, the way his thoughts unraveled everything he once believed about our marriage. Each realization seemed to strike him like a blow. Then I heard footsteps at the door. John hadn't gone far. He returned, perhaps intending to say something to defuse the situation, but his presence only made it worse. Ryan turned toward him, his expression hardening further. John hesitated, sensing that anything he said would only escalate the conflict. Without speaking, Ryan took a few deliberate steps toward him, gesturing for him to leave. John nodded, understanding there was no reason to stay. His eyes lingered on me for a brief moment, filled with regret and something else I couldn't name. He left without a word, and the silence that followed his departure felt deafening. When Ryan turned back to me, his eyes were void of anything but icy emptiness. He didn't speak again. His silence was more terrifying than any outburst. He simply walked out of the room, leaving me alone. I sank into a chair, feeling the weight of guilt and doubt tearing me apart. Inside, everything screamed that the damage was irreparable. I knew this moment marked the point of no return, and no matter what I did, There was no way to reclaim the life I had lost. I found the letter in the morning while tidying up the living room. The envelope lay at the edge of the table, as though John had left it at the very last moment before leaving. I tore it open carefully, as if it contained not just words, but something that could alter my life even further. Caitlin, I never meant for things to go this far. I should have left sooner, without getting involved in your life. I only made everything more complicated when it was already difficult enough. You deserve peace and happiness, and I only destroyed that. I'm sorry, John. His words were simple, but they struck something deep within me. I sat clutching the letter, feeling tears burn my eyes. This was a goodbye I hadn't expected, but perhaps it was inevitable. Ryan barely spoke to me. His silence, cold and distant, filled the house more than our conversations ever had. He left for work earlier than usual and came home late. When he was home, his presence felt like an unbearable reminder of what I had broken. I tried to start a conversation, but my attempts shattered against the wall of his indifference. He looked at me as though I were no longer a part of his life. It was alienating and painfully sharp, cutting through what remained of my feelings. One evening I met Sarah to talk. I needed to let it all out, to find some semblance of an answer. Leave for a while, she said after I finished. You need to get your head straight and figure out what you really want. I couldn't disagree. The house, which had once been a place of comfort, had become a constant reminder of my mistakes. The next day, I began packing. It wasn't easy, but deep down, I felt it was the right move. I knew leaving wouldn't solve the problem, but perhaps it would give me the chance to understand how to move forward. I sat in the kitchen holding John's letter. His words had been read countless times, but I kept returning to them, as though they held the answers to my endless questions. The silence around me was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Ryan was upstairs. The sound of drawers opening and footsteps echoed through the empty house. I knew he was packing, but I didn't try to stop him. Each of his steps reverberated in my mind like a heavy blow, a reminder that our life would never be the same. I tried to pinpoint when everything had gone wrong. Was it the moment with John, or had the cracks formed long before that? Perhaps we had simply stopped hearing each other, and I sought solace where I shouldn't have. Ryan came downstairs, his suitcase creaking against the steps. He looked composed, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He walked past me without a word. "Are you leaving?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. He paused for a moment but didn't turn around. His response was brief. "I need time." I knew it wasn't a promise to come back. The door closed behind him, leaving me alone. I remained at the table, feeling the emptiness settle over me. The letter in my hands was a reminder of what I had lost. This new reality was cold and uncertain. I didn't know if there was a chance to fix anything, or if everything was irreparably broken. The only thing left was to accept the consequences of my actions and try to figure out how to move forward. The question of the future hung in the air, unanswered but with a palpable sense that it would never be the same.